Hi, everyone. This is Ryan Grover. I'm the curator of collections here at the museum, so I am the person in charge of bringing new additions into the permanent collection to interpret those collections for audiences, and then also I organize all of the feature exhibitions. I'm also sort of the museum's publisher, so for catalogs and things of that nature. And today we are going to bring you through actually two exhibitions. We'll start with our first exhibition here on the first floor, then we'll go through some of our permanent collection, and we will head up into the third floor, which is our second feature exhibition. We've sort of opened them up at the same time. More the merrier, I guess, here at the Biggs Museum. So the first exhibition here is called In Fresh Air, Impressionism and the Plein Air Movement. We have here at the museum a really decent Impressionist collection, especially sort of regional Impressionism of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, of course. But then as we started to look around, we also had a lot of what are called plein air studies. So these are artist renderings out in nature. So plein air is just basically a French term that means basically out in nature. And these are artists that took their artist materials, their papers and their watercolors or their oil paints and their little canvases and boards, whatever the case might be, but they went out directly into nature and they decided that they were going to paint the scene directly in front of them, but trying really hard to capture the light and climatic conditions that they were in the middle of. Plein air painting is typically short-lived. It's usually very fastly rendered, and it is meant to sort of capture a couple of climate conditions at that moment, really within a couple hours period of time, and then you move on. The idea of plein air painting is not new. This is something that artists have been doing for a really, really, really long time, probably for as long as they've been painting landscapes, really. But the earlier examples of plein air painting that we have in the collection here sort of point to the fact that plein air painters, people that were working outside, they were out there taking notes. They were doing like simple notations of these paintings that they were sort of capturing sort of shorthand, the subject in front of them. And then they would take those notes back to the studio and they would create larger exhibition grade artworks specifically using those notes. So they would sort of use those notes as a way of sort of informing this larger composition. I'm going to actually start you right back here in this corner. This is a great example of that kind of shorthand plein air work. This is a work by William Thompson Russell Smith. He was sort of a Philadelphia, well, he eventually ended up in Philadelphia. And he has just made a little sort of ink and watercolor wash painting of a spot that he and his wife were eventually going to build a house. This was probably never really meant to be exhibited. He didn't really want to share this kind of thing with his patrons or with the general public that were looking at his work. This is not the kind of work that he's really well known for in the larger exhibitions, those are public exhibitions. But it probably was work like this that helped to inform the landscapes that he was doing of the area around Philadelphia. So if we sort of pan backwards, it doesn't take long for plein air in the 1800s to become a kind of a new kind of art form that's very exciting to people, and that collectors and artists and museums and gallerists, everybody sort of collectively started to understand that plein air painting could be its own subject by itself, that people could admire plein air painting and that people could develop it into even more interesting concepts. And so I wanted to compare the piece that we just saw to this work by Isaac Williams, which is also probably started plein air.
We have a very quick question.
Yeah.
All the artwork that we're seeing today, is it specifically American?
Yes. There are a couple of scenes that are going to be by American artists while they're in Europe, but for the most part, everything that you're going to see today is American. So focusing on this painting right here. So this is probably a work that was started plein air. There is a consideration of light source. There's consideration of shadow under the trees, the cast shadows of the cows. But also look at the level of the heightened level of detail here. The artist has not only sort of captured these sort of the cloud cover, the sort of the light shining through those clouds, and the way that it sort of bounces off the subjects in his landscape, but he's also sort of added this extra detail, the little birds in the sky, these tiny little hash marks of things growing in the foreground. And it's really, I mean, it's a remarkable watercolor. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece, incredibly detailed, especially given its scale. But it's this sort of elevated plein air work. This could have been more than just an artist notation. This seems to have a level of finish that meant that it was being developed for audience appreciation. So early plein air work sort of bounces between work that was done exclusively outside, as well as work that was started outside and then was finished indoors, probably, or in some sort of studio setting, or perhaps over several periods, several sort of like sessions outside. And so we find that there's a range of sort of plein air, and there's a range of appreciation of plein air. But the exhibition here at the museum starts off with this sort of movement of plein air studies, just to sort of give you an impression, sometimes in watercolors, sometimes like the work that you see here by a guy named Whitteridge. He's associated with the Hudson School. This is a view of the Catskills, a sort of forest scene in the Catskills. This is a plein air work. This is meant as a study, but it's done in oil paints. Now, oil paints, watercolors, sorry, let me step back for a second. Watercolors started to be produced in little bricks of color starting in the 1700s that were very portable. You'd be able to move them from location to location, use them just with a little bit of water and some brushes. The actual materials of watercolor paints in that time frame were not especially difficult to master. You could sort of stick them in your pocket or stick them in a bag or have them with a small easel and everything would be fine. However, early oil paints, up until like the mid 1800s, oil paints were hand ground in the studio from the original materials like minerals and different kinds of plant materials and things of that nature. And those oil paints really labor intensive, and there was no really good solution for preserving those oil paints over long periods of time. So you really ground what you needed. So it really wasn't very practical to paint outdoors with oil paints. This started changing mid 1800s with the invention of oil paints, like industrially produced oil paints in metal tubes, much like what we see today. Those were also created with sort of synthetic colors. So the coloration of oil paints also changes from purely natural tones to much more vibrant and crazy tones. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So just sort of panning a few more of these sort of plein air studies from the collection in various levels of finish and sketch-like qualities. These are works by Edmund Darch Lewis, a Philadelphia painter. And you can see just by sort of glancing over those couple, there's a variety of sort of levels of finish with the work that he produced. So one of the things that I wanted to sort of focus on within this exhibition was this idea, let me get a little better light here so you're not in the dark, was this idea that plein air painters, or I should say painters that are creating exhibition grade works. This is true of Americans, this is true of Europeans, but there were different approaches, different ways of using plein air artwork to create finished arts, to create finished paintings. And a lot of these were dictated by the academy systems that American artists were using in Europe. So we had a level of art education that was happening here in America starting the end of the 1700s. So there's a couple of academies that start popping up really after American independence, and then really started developing in the mid 19th century. But a lot of painters starting in those 1700s and into the 20th century may have started their education here, whether at the academy or in private private education directly with an artist in their studio. But many of those artists also finished their work, did advanced study in places in Europe. And so part of that study might have happened observing different collections in England. Part of that might have been participating in academic classes in Germany. And then also a lot of artists went to France. There were also people that went to Italy and other sort of European destinations. But some of the three major ones that we're aware of were people that studied in England or studied English artists that came to America. So one of the consummate examples of this is the work by Thomas Cole. Sorry. So Thomas Cole, sort of the figure, he's sort of thought of as sort of like the father of American landscape painting, the founder of the Hudson Valley School of American Landscape Painting. Say that 4 times fast. Thomas Cole was known to create plein air studies, little sketches, and he would create, in the British tradition, he would create fantasy landscapes based upon his observations. So this does not depict any known location, but it does depict a series of different sort of tree formations, rivers, rocks, mountains that he had witnessed and then brought together in this idealized form. We're going to move on quick. James Hamilton's The Niagara Falls. These are all part of the permanent collection. It's really fun to use them in these ways because normally, and you'll see upstairs, they're usually on view in our timeline presentation. James Hamilton was looking at some very important British painters in the 1700s when he traveled to England, and it really inspired the kind of loose brushstroke that you see here, the sort of wispy, misty, airy sort of use of color in the foreground, and these kind of incomplete brushstrokes, these sort of open-ended brushstrokes that you see that imply all of this motion of water down the falls. I'm going to come around you. Here are a couple of quick examples of individuals who were known to do plein air painting and to contribute and have those paintings contribute to their finished works. And these are individuals that did it in sort of with German academic background. So this is Albert Bierstadt. Lots of people have heard of Albert Bierstadt. He was also a Hudson Valley painter and was one of the first major painters of the American West. Well, he didn't create his enormous paintings of the American West on location. He painted them after he got back traveling across the new railroads with a suitcase full of drawings and quick paintings of the spaces that he had been to. Then we have Hermann Herzog. Hermann Herzog was actually a German immigrant to the area. He did exceptionally well. He even sold to, I think it was like Tsar Nicholas of Russia before he ended up coming to America. But he traveled extensively in America and did small plein air paintings and then finished works of American landscape. The German sort of tradition really, really honors highly naturalistic detail, really, really complex detail, almost sort of a scientific observation of nature in the landscape. And that's definitely true, both of Herzog and of Bierstadt. And then we can come across individuals that really started developing in France what we call the Barbizon tradition. So these are American artists that went to France so that they could study alongside French masters outdoors. The French were really some of the first artists to take that notion of plein air painting and really elevate that idea of painting outdoors to art forms in its own. It was through Barbizon and the work that people were doing on location, painting these very specific climatic conditions over short periods of time with these very fast, loose brushstrokes. These artists were the artists that helped to really accelerate towards Impressionism. And we're going to move into the next gallery that starts talking about that sort of Impressionist moment, that sort of departure. Before we get there, so there were a whole group of Americans that went to Barbizon. They studied this technique of painting outdoors, and they started to really sort of understand the Barbizon, the kind of purity of Barbizon. A lot of Barbizon artists wanted you to go outside with your oil paints in tubes, with your canvas or board, and paint your scene within a couple of hours so that you can grab those kind of climatic conditions, and then you are supposed to be done. There was no additional work to be done with this work. And all of that work had, or I should say a great deal of that work, has a real sketch-like quality. Not everything is delineated. Not all the details are there. It's not the details that they were after, but it was a sort of quick rendering of those things. Those Americans came back to the United States, and they created what we now term as tonalism. One of the first sort of movements, American movements, or sort of American evolutions of the Barbizon style of plein air painting. And so the work that you see here is by a guy named John Henry Twachtman. It's called Old Orchard. And this was actually painted in Italy while the artist was studying there. I guess he was sort of studying, but really he was sort of practicing artwork. So he is in this orchard. He uses this loose brushstroke to create these quickly applied sort of images. He uses long brush strokes. You can sort of see that he kind of one sort of brush stroke, he sort of uses this dark green and creates this whole line to the tree. That most of what you see here afterwards, the sort of shadow of the tree, is also just one big brush stroke. After that's done, he also toned the entire scene with a kind of, I don't know, sort of this warm tone. There's this kind of sandy tan sort of presence over the entire artwork that sort of helps to blend all the works together as one in one sort of mood. So tonalism is described as tonalism because there was this desire to be almost monochromatic in the use of colors. They definitely painted quickly, they painted on site, but then they also tried to add this kind of quiet moodiness to the artwork that is really kind of poetic. I'm going to have you turn to the left here and take a quick look at the George Inness painting, which is this is a Hudson Valley, a view of the Hudson Valley, and it is another sort of tonalist work by one of America's great masters of tonalism. And you can see here, hopefully the camera is sort of picking this up, there's a kind of pale blue wash over this that sort of helps to sort of give everything the impression of sort of like early dawn, or kind of talks about sort of like this sort of a moment of awakening, of all the greens are waking up in the morning. And that eventually you're going to see this lush color sort of bloom forth. But right now you're still in that early stages of the day. So follow me and we'll start talking directly about where this went to. So American painters kept going to France and to other parts of Europe, but France was really the sort of the main motivator for Impressionism. So Impressionism is plein air painting using these synthetic colors. There is a kind of, especially in French Impressionism, there is this desire to capture the whole scene in one sitting. You didn't really want to add too much more to that sitting. And artists are some artists are noted for being absolute purists about that kind of formula. And some people take stuff back to the studio and they sort of add to them. And we try and delineate that a little bit here at the museum so that you can talk about pieces that are truly plein air impressionist works, so that these are works that are probably done almost exclusively outside to be able to sort of capture. This is by a guy named William Merritt Chase, and just a remarkably beautiful painting, painted outdoors, probably during one of his sort of public lessons. He would take on students, and he would teach plein air techniques in New England. William Merritt Chase was really known for these long, almost kind of signature types of brush strokes. So he would just take this wide brush and he would just streak it directly across the entire surface. And that would be basically his horizon line, that he had enough sort of experience with his wrist to be able to just sort of draw out this elegant line and then create these sort of hash marks of forms in the gold, in the brighter green, in the darker greens, to create this idea of sort of grass in front of it. The shape of these twigs that are holding the haystacks in place. This is one, perhaps two simple brush strokes, but he captures the entire essence of that form really quickly, really methodically, and is able to just sort of quickly move on from that. And so he had what we call this bravura, B-R-A-V-U-R-A, brushstroke technique, that he just had this incredible skill to economically use very few brushstrokes to be able to create that impression of the work, of the subject, I should say. Follow me a little bit further down. Impressionism didn't necessarily pick up in America right away. It took a while for things to really develop here. A lot of artists and their patrons were still very, very interested in high levels of detail and intense naturalism, like the work that we saw with like Albert Bierstadt and Thomas Cole. But the idea of that sort of loosening brushstroke, that idea of artists placing a lot of themselves and their own signatures, sorry for the background noise, their own signature application of paint onto the surface, and that brushstroke would become wider and more expressive, became much, much more appealing to collectors as time went on. There were groups of artists that would congregate outside of the cities to be able to study nature directly using impressionistic brushstrokes and impressionistic techniques. And little by little, that level of popularity rose. This work that you're taking a look at, this is a view of the Delaware River by a guy named Walter Elmer Schofield. And he was one of the founders of what's called the Bucks County Impressionists. This is a group of Philadelphia painters who studied Impressionism up the Delaware River in Bucks County, of course. But one of the things that sort of represented this group of artists, one of the things that they were really well known for was not only this very dramatic application of paint. You can sort of see all of the texture that's left on the surface. You can just feel how quickly this paint was applied to the surface, and with good reason. I'll have Kristen back up just a little bit, but this huge canvas that you see here was painted almost entirely on location at this river in winter. The canvas was probably just propped up against one of the trees, and he painted from life in the middle of these conditions. In this scale, excuse me, it's really kind of crazy to think of. And there are photographs of him and his contemporaries doing this kind of work outdoors. But it's nuts. They would stand far back enough from the scene so that they would be able to sort of see the thing that they were depicting. And they would use these very long brushes, and they would just sort of get in there and just slop the paint around and move it. And it's really, there's something almost sort of sculptural about the work. And you have to remember, oil paints don't freeze, or at least they don't freeze easily. So they were a medium that did work really well in inhospitable conditions. this equipment. So there are a few other artists. I'm just going to show you one or two others before we start moving upstairs. I don't want to get too far off our timeline. But this is Frederick Waugh. He's an impressionist painter. He worked in a variety of different styles. This is him doing work that's pretty modern feeling. He did not, as far as we know, paint a lot of these works, especially the work that you're looking at right now, in front of crashing waves on the edge of the ocean. This is a work that was probably almost entirely done in the studio, but it is done in an impressionist style. So the loose brushwork, the bright colors, the use of the synthetic paints, and this fast application of paint is still being done here, but it's being done from his notes and it's being done from his own imagination in order to be able to create these spewing water, these sort of jets of water, these waves that are sort of crashing on the ocean. Also, if you notice, and you'll get up close, this is wonderful. He's painted layers of oil paint down, and then he scratched through them in order to be able to create this really, really sort of rocky surfaces of the stones in the foreground. It's just wonderful stuff. But this is an impressionist style of painting. This is not necessarily that purist French idea of painting directly from life. Even so, it's pretty terrific. We'll just sort of come right over here. Follow me, follow me. This is probably one of our most famous paintings in the collection. It's a guy named Robert Reed. It's called Summer Girl. And I'm stopping here just to remind individuals that not all Impressionist painting, and especially not all plein air painting, is landscape. A lot of it is. We definitely love landscapes, and the Impressionist painters did as well. But lots of people were depicted in the Impressionist style as well. And so this is an Impressionist painter doing a series, and he did an extensive series of these idealized female forms. This is done right around 1900. I think it was like 1899, and it's a demonstration not of any single person, although he probably had a model to work from, but this is supposed to be an evocation of the modern woman. And so the modern woman with her sleeves rolled up, she's ready for action. She's got a little bit of sun on her face. She's not the sort of, not strictly that Victorian ideal of pale white that was so common 10 and 15 years earlier. She's got the straw hat on. She is outdoors. She's depicted outdoors. And she's also depicted in the latest style, which painting style, which is Impressionism. So she's depicted with these loose, bright colors, loose applications of paint, these sort of unfinished surfaces. There's no crisp line around the edge of the subject. There is this, she is sort of broken down into individual strokes of paint. And people thought of it as this very modern, very fresh, very young, very vital kind of artistic style. People still sort of associate it with in that manner, I think. And Robert Reed definitely sort of exploited that idea of using Impressionism to imply youth and vitality. So I'm going to have Kristen just do a little bit of a sort of glance of the camera through some of our depictions of a major American and European cities in Impressionism, while I run upstairs to the second camera so we can get started on Gallery 2. I think Kristen is here to start answering questions if you have any, and I will be back online in just a moment. Bye.
Hi. You asked about, we have someone asking about Mary Cassatt. I think it was this wall that you were referencing. This is not Mary Cassatt. We don't have her in our collection at this point. But we do have a series of other artists, particularly female artists, creating paintings of other female artists. For example, as I pan through some of our sort of leaning realism paintings of cities, I'm going to put you over here facing my camera a second. Ruth A. Anderson. Ruth A. Anderson is a female artist, and she is the painter of this other artist, Grace Gerbeling Keast. And she's shown, Grace, the sitter for this, is shown wearing sort of a artist smock and a very fancy hat that she had actually become known for. And in here we have Ruth A. Anderson blending together her personal style, which was sort of like a whimsical, almost abstraction. She started getting very into sort of cubist ideas and these flat surfaces, with that of how Grace Gerbeling Keast would paint, which was, she was known for her use of color and sort of a playful, whimsical air. And with that, I'm going to send us upstairs to join Ryan.
Hey everybody, I hope you can hear me. Please let Kristen know if you're having any problems with the volume. We've just changed cameras, so that's always sort of a tricky moment for us, but we'll continue on. I'm just going to pretend like everybody can hear me just fine, and we'll just sort of see what happens. So thanks for being with us for the Impressionism and the Plein Air and the Plein Air period downstairs. There's so much more to that show. You should definitely take a chance to come to the museum and take a look at it in person. It's really, really fun. One of the things that you might have picked up on is that we deliberately hung the paintings a little bit lower than most museums do, because we really want people to get their noses right up into it. We want them to be able to see those brushstrokes and see that intense coloration. So I hope that you have a chance to sort of enjoy that. While you're here, you should definitely come up to the second floor here, where I am right now, and start taking a look at some of the historic collections that we are really well known for. Our museum's founder, Sewell C. Biggs, started this collection. He really started collecting in his youth. So probably in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And some of the first things that he collected were locally produced furniture forms, so furniture of the 18th century, 1700s. It really wasn't until after around 1970 or so that he started collecting paintings in substantial numbers. And so his first love was really architecture and the contents of that architecture. And he worked to help preserve a number of sort of important 18th and early 19th century buildings, especially the sort of middle section of Delaware. But I digress. We can do that toward another time when we talk specifically about Sewell. But our collections, the permanent collections here at the museum, are, like I said earlier, sort of on a timeline basis. And they start here in Gallery 8 with works that were done starting, we have a couple of things here that were done in the 1600s, but a lot of the furniture itself starts at around 1730 and then moves up until maybe just before the American Revolution, in a time period called the American Baroque. So follow me a little bit and we will sort of take a quick look around. This is some of the things that we're really well known for in this particular part of the world is colonial architecture, colonial paintings. But one of the great sort of masterpieces of that is on view here on long-term loan to us from the state of Delaware, and that's this portrait of Vincent Lockerman. Lockerman was an 18th century merchant in the area. Occupied a house starting in the 1740s until his death in like 1789 or something like that. Only about 2 blocks from here. The house is still owned by his descendants, which is crazy. But a lot of the furniture here at the museum in this gallery came from that house, and they represent some of the earliest known objects, some of the earliest known furniture made in Delaware. So it's not to say that there wasn't other furniture made before 1740, but we do have but we just don't have a lot of it. We haven't seen a lot of other furniture made before 1740. It's definitely around, and we're always on the hunt for it. So keep following me, and we will head into Gallery 9. So this is the next step up the timeline presentation. Let's get you a little bit closer here. And I think I'm just going to point us off in this direction a little bit. So this is artwork that was being created here in America, leading up to the period of the American Revolution. This is called the American Rococo, and this time period runs from the 1750s up until about 1785. This style was probably most prominent up to the American Revolution, but it's not like you just turn one style switch off and then turn another one on. There's always this kind of blending and overlapping. Here at the museum, like we said before, we collected the fine and decorative arts. Sewell, our founder, was really interested in being able to show people many of the different kinds of art forms that were available at a particular time frame, so that you would be able to get a sort of real great feeling for that time period. And we are an American art museum, so we collect a lot of things broadly American, but we try and tell a lot of Delaware stories. So for instance, the big fireplace around the sort of architectural element that you see surrounding this fireplace behind me, this beautiful paneled wall. This came from a house out of Wilmington, Delaware, that was built in the 1750s and was unfortunately taken down sometime, I think, in the 1960s. The silver that you see over my shoulder here, a lot of this is done in Philadelphia. So local stories, sometimes created for Wilmington patrons. And then we also have this painting that I wanted to share with you, which is remarkable. This is a portrait of Mary Wincoop Ridgely. She lived here in Dover, literally right around the corner. And unfortunately died in 1772. She died in childbirth with her second child. And the portrait that you see here had been owned by the Ridgely family in the same house right around the corner until it came to us here at the Biggs Museum. It was gifted to the museum just a couple of years ago. It was painted by a guy named Charles Wilson Peale. We'll see more of his work later, but he was a very prominent Philadelphia portrait painter before and after the American Revolution. And he is originally from Annapolis, Maryland, which helps to sort of explain this lady. And the other thing that's interesting about this, well, there's lots that's interesting. I think I talk all day just about this portrait. But like I said, she died in 1772 in childbirth. This painting was done in 1773. So this is a post-mortem portrait. We don't yet know if it was based upon maybe like a portrait miniature, or if some sort of family member might have stepped in for her, like a sister or something like that. But it is sort of a memorial likeness of the artist. So follow me. I'm totally behind in time, so we will not spend too much time in this area. The works that you see on this floor don't change up to here. Well, we make alterations in here all the time, but the basic format of this timeline is pretty well in place. So you're able to come and see this kind of work anytime. Just a couple of quick highlights. This is a room of furniture created by a group of family members called the Janviers, spelled like the French January. And one cabinet maker, John Janvier, he then trains his sons and several apprentices to be furniture makers in their own rights. And then they then turn around and train another generation. So you can see the influence in this family over a really long period of time. Keep coming. This is the Silver Study Center. Sorry if I get kind of echoey in here, but this is about 750 pieces of Delaware made and retailed silver objects. We collect not only silver silver vessels and ladles and things of that nature, talking about sort of the evolution of style from about 1740 up to about 1900. But we also collect makers' marks. So the actual little stamps that artists or the silversmiths use to identify their individual pieces. So we display all of these wares in such a way that you'll be able to use them as study pieces, perhaps for your own collections. This is work done in the time of the American Revolution and then just afterwards. And people often ask us about the wallpaper. The wallpapers that you see in this room, they are not antiques themselves, although they are perfect reproductions or fairly good reproductions of 18th and 19th century wallpaper styles. So what you see here, this design, with only a couple of small alterations, was being produced in these colors in Philadelphia up until the time of the American Revolution. It's a lot of look. It's a difficult one to live with, but it is really, really emblematic of the time period, and we love it. The paintings that you see sort of superimposed on the wallpaper is works by different members of that Charles Wilson Peale family that I was telling you about. So Charles Wilson Peale, the portrait painter, then trained his brother, his sons, his daughters, his nieces to become professional painters in their own right. And he created this whole sort of Peale family legacy, this dynasty for a few generations of painters in Philadelphia and eventually in Baltimore. While the gallery that we were just in that talked about the federal style is a really sort of urban aesthetic. It's an aesthetic that's associated with London, and it's an aesthetic that sort of it's sort of the local manifestation of kind of a big sort of universal metropolitan style that really kind of spread across English-speaking peoples all over the world. On the other side of that is work that does not necessarily try to be cosmopolitan. It attempts very hard to hold on to the aesthetic traditions of the places that a lot of these artists and patrons came from. So holding on to their sort of ethnic identities, even though they moved to the New World or they moved to other sort of British colonies all over the world. We're talking about folk art. So the development, or there are folk traditions in every culture, and those traditions basically spread wherever people move to. People try to recreate the objects that they were familiar with in the places that they came from. And so this gallery starts to explore some of those things, some of those forms that weren't necessarily trying to be the most fashionable, but were trying to remind people of home. So we're further up the time frame now. Again, this is a little bit echoey in here. We've moved over into the 1850 portion of the building. So what you see here, this metal staircase, this staircase from cast iron, it's known as Delaware's first fireproof staircase, and it's original to this building, but it does create a little bit of an echo in this particular space. Surrounding it is artwork that was created in the time period of about 1810 up to about the 1840s. And this is known as the American Empire period. So this is an aesthetic style. This is a style of decorative arts and ultimately fine arts that were really heavily influenced by the court of Napoleon Bonaparte in France. He was, up until the time that he became a complete tyrant, and even afterwards, he was greatly admired in the mid-Atlantic part of the United States. And so people really did emulate the styles and the fashionable sort of ideas that came from his court. So we use a lot of refined woods. We use a lot of sort of classical design. So designs that were based upon Greek and Roman antiquity. And we see a acute proliferation of portraits. It's during this time frame that you start to see some of the first really conscientious American landscapes. And a lot of gilding. This is not a this is not a style for the faint of heart. Sort of overlapping with the American Empire is the Greek Revival. So starting in the 1820s, 1830s, we really see an American a concentrated interest in America of the antiquities that were being dug up on the Greek peninsula. And so we draw a lot of attention, a lot of interest of the temples and the statues, especially the statues, but even sort of like cast iron furniture and other kinds of furniture forms that were actually dug up in archaeology. You know, you can think about this being the time frame that people started to understand that Herculaneum was there, that Pompeii was there, that they could dig into the ground and find traces of these past cultures. But those art forms were hugely influential upon artists here. And so we find a lot of individuals like Hiram Powers and Thomas Crawford, the two sculptors that you see on the pedestals back here. These are artists that start sculpting in America and then move to Italy to study directly from Italian, classical marble sculptures from hundreds and sometimes even thousands of years earlier. And so you can see how much that classical past has really influenced what these artists were working on, like the forms that they create, the things that they want to sort of represent in modern day. You will also admire the wallpaper. I am sure it's one of my favorites in the museum. Getting through the doors with our tripods is always a little bit of a challenge. So sorry if we sort of rock around a little bit, but you're going to be fine. One of the last sort of major galleries that I wanted to show you here on the second floor. So we're already up to the time period of about 1840 to 1860. And this is the Hudson School. So our museum's founder was really, really proactive early on and purchased a number of these landscape paintings. The first, earlier in the 20th century when you could still afford them. But these are works by a lot of New York trained artists that use the Hudson Valley as their muse a lot. So you see depictions of New England, Upper New York. You also find a lot of depictions of some of the great kind of features of the American landscape. So like the Niagara Falls becomes a really, really important subject, and the Bucket Valley in Connecticut, and Western scenes. So you start to see the first artistic depictions of places like Yosemite and the great, the Grand Canyon. And all of these things, these natural elements of the American landscapes, as we started to discover them as a people, they became hugely, hugely important as artistic subjects for artists all over the world. So again, Kristen's going to take a couple of minutes here in this gallery while I run upstairs and get ready to be able to show you the third floor.
So we have a question about the artist Benjamin West. I will double check with Ryan as soon as he's hooked up. I have not come across that name in our collection yet, but that does not mean we do not have him. So that's my non-answer to your question about Benjamin West. And I'll bring you over to this piece. This has recently been put up. Some of the artworks that you saw down in the Plein Air exhibition typically are up in this room. This one has since been moved in.
Welcome back. We're here on the third floor, and I'm going to give you sort of a quick, 15 minutes of the out of the vault modern and contemporary art here at the Biggs Museum. So a lot of the work, as Kristen was just pointing out, some of the work on the second floor had to go downstairs to the first floor to support that Impressionism and Plein Air show. If you think that I took a lot of works from the second, third floor, which was great because it gave us this opportunity to bring out things from the object storage here at the museum that we don't get to see a lot, that we don't get to go into great depth over. And it's not that we don't want to. The modern and contemporary collections here at the museum are some of the fastest growing sections of our permanent collection. The difficulty is that we're just kind of a small institution. We don't have a lot of gallery space. So a lot of these newer collections, really, we just haven't grown yet to be able to accommodate them. But we're working on it. So keep your fingers crossed. But here we're going to just sort of delve into modern painting. So, what is modernism? Modernism is a term that we have now given to artwork that really sort of spans the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution. It is linked to the Industrial Revolution, but it's not like a prerequisite. It's not like we just sort of said, oh, well, it just started, the Industrial Revolution started and everything's machines and cities. So we're just going to be talking about it now. Really, a lot of museum people, a lot of collectors, a lot of artists started to see a distinctly different attitude towards art making in the period, starting in the 1860s or so, up until the 1960s. And a lot of the artists that were there were really, really focused on this very sort of individualism, the strong sense of individualism, that each one was trying to create their own sort of signature appearance, that they weren't necessarily dedicating themselves exclusively to sort of academic training or to international trends in art form. But a lot of people were trying to strike out on their own and trying to find something that was very new and very distinct. But a lot of that is also tied to the past. So when we were downstairs and we were talking about Impressionism and we were talking about the importance of color, people started to have really emotional connections to the colors of paintings, a lot of colors that they hadn't seen in paintings before. And then at the same time, there was this great interest in abstraction. So simplification of the artistic subject. Sometimes you get so simple with that the subject of the artwork, whether it be a flower or a waterfall or a seashell or whatever, sometimes that doesn't even matter as much as the way that people are using the materials that create paintings, like the different sense of colors, like line or volume or shape. These sort of artistic features become much, much more important. So I'm going to turn us around real quick so that we can focus on one particular painting in this room before. There we go. I'm handing over to Kristen because she's so much better at this than I am. And we're going to talk about Arthur Karl's. This is you can still tell what's going on here. These are flowers. They're coming out of this bowl. It's kind of an interior space. There's a little piece of sort of this cloth underneath. But this is really heavily abstracted. A lot of these things are simplified into simple lines for the stems, just a couple of brush strokes to represent irises and different sort of floral forms. But while the artist is simplifying an accurate depiction of flowers in a vase or in a bowl in this case, while Arthur is simplifying that, he really turns up the volume on some other things. So he's really turning up the volume on color. There's a lot of emotional sense of color in this, these bright oranges and greens, the dark blues that you see in the background, these kind of scribbled and erratic set places of purple. So color is really important, and the artist's gesture. You can literally see the marks that this person has put on the surface here. You can literally just feel that paintbrush just adding the shadow over in the corner. And the artist giving you an insight, like a deep look into what it is that they were thinking of, what they were doing, like what their process was, that you see that manifest in the work. That sort of individualism that the artist is showing you is something that becomes incredibly much, much more important during this modern period. Modern painting lasts for a long time. It's still sort of modern painting. There are modern painters out there today. For example, this artist known simply as Valletta. This is a work called Cage. It came to the museum just a little while ago, and this is largely pastel on paper. But she's still very much working within the modernist, within that same sort of modernist vein. There's a simplification of a human form. There's these kind of gestures of color around this person. There's the simplification of the sort of open table form surrounding the lower portion of this person's body. You get an idea of things that are happening here, but there's also this like dreamlike nature. You're not really sure how these things are connected other than they're connected formally. They're connected in the way that they look. And there is this really deliberate action by the artist to leave a lot of questions in the air. They're not filling in entirely the body in naturalistic detail. They're not describing this table fully. They're not describing the form that sort of helps shape and frame the narrative of this piece. They're not answering a lot of those things for you. You are allowed to answer those things for yourself. Let's move on, because I'm now 1 minute over time and I still have a couple of things to show you. So as artists start to abstract their work, some artists start to go deep into abstraction and really start playing with different ideas about exaggerating certain formal elements like color or line or whatever the case may be. Other artists are really dedicated to realism. They're really dedicated to the real and depicting scenes of things that you can easily identify. A lot of them are doing it in a very modern way. Sometimes they're using plein air. Sometimes they are using, like the examples that you're looking at right now are all plein air studies, bright colors, but of industrial scenes. Well, the two on the right are both industrial scenes. Sometimes they are meant to sort of depict very kind of regional subjects. So talking about some sort of cultural signifiers, different kinds of architecture, different manners of dressing, different activities that distinguish one culture in America from another. But then in other cases, people are just using what's modern here is oftentimes the subject. So you see a lot of industrialization, you see a lot of urbanization, you see increased attention on subjects that aren't normally or had not normally been the subjects of fine art. So these are not magnificent landscapes. They are not beautiful women in summer hats. These are not, rich people in leisure pursuits. These are often simpler scenes of little towns, churches, people laboring. Sometimes they are even of decaying architecture or abandoned spaces. But even though realism really pushes at the boundaries of what is acceptable in terms of subjects within art, but it's always pretty much depicted in very realistic terms. So keep following me. You can see one of my junk rooms. I'm totally joking. This is just a gallery that we have to reinstall. We're going to temporarily a lot of my artists we're really sort of focused on or really interested in. I'm just going to move my camera here just a smidge. worry about the base. Modern art, the subjects and philosophies and ethics, the things that were important to people during the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, is artwork that was being created after about 1960, 1970, you might say. And the real change is not necessarily that we've become different as a people, but some of the subjects that we're really interested in talking about, that artists of this time period are interested in talking about, have to do not with the same things that they were focused on during the modern period. So things have shifted, attitudes have changed, and artistic processes have changed. We start to see during the contemporary era the ascendancy of the sort of rise of importance around video, not just photography, but actually video work as media for fine arts. We talk a lot about performance and sort of capturing ritual activities within small sort of theatrical vignettes and producing them for individual presentations within museums and galleries and such. But we also talk about who gets to be an artist. The modern period was interested in creating an American modernism. So they wanted America, the site of America, to be an important center of of artistic production. Now we want to expand who we are calling American. We want to make sure that we are involving all voices. We want to make sure that it's not just one dominant group that has all of the attention within the art world. We want to expose individuals of color. We want to expose different genders. We want to be able to expose people of different sexualities. We want to hear from the wide range of American perspective. And so contemporary art is sort of further efforts of egalitarianism. At the same time, it's still dealing with a lot of the earlier sort of ideas. It's still concerned with craft. It's still concerned with painting techniques. It still sort of incorporates a lot of the same technologies as before. It just adds to that. So in this room, a couple of just sort of some fun highlights. I think I'm going to show you this one. This is an op art piece created by a woman named Myrna Bloom. She is a painter in Philadelphia, and this was an early contemporary art addition to the museum, a gift of the artist. And you can see that there are no real highlights or lowlights in this painting. There are lots of different chairs reproduced over and over and over again. They create this sort of pattern of paint, like a pattern in the composition, but it's almost sort of a jarring appearance because there really are, like, all the colors here have the same value. There are not darker, they're not brighter, they're not lighter. There is no sense of light or form. It's just this sort of patterning of value that is really, really fun. And it does, when you're looking at it directly, it does kind of cause your eyes to cross just a little bit, but it also makes you wonder about the importance or lack of importance in subject. Sometimes it's really about color combinations and sort of what those colors do to you on an individual basis. Great example of that is behind me. This is a totally abstract work by a guy named Willem de Looper. He is part of what's called the Washington Color School, sort of a group of abstract painters that were really, really interested in playing with the newly invented qualities of acrylic paint as opposed to oil paint. And so these artists were really interested in mixing acrylic paint up with water and using it as a staining device on unprimed canvas. And so there was no underpainting. They didn't paint the surface gray or white first and then paint on top of it. They literally just sort of dipped this diluted acrylic paint in these very bright colors. They stamped it, they pressed it into, they sort of let it roll around and kind of soak into these canvases and create their own sort of organic liquid forms over the surface. Willem de Looper is sort of a second generation artist there, and he is not focused on any particular subject other than color, shape, form, movement of those materials. And it's really fun and it's huge. And I love big artwork. So Welcome to the base. I'm really late. You have to come. I will come personally tell you about the sculpture the next time you come. Our last gallery then swings back into realism again. So even though all these artists have been playing with abstraction, all these artists have been playing with color and form and all these interesting, fun, but really, really specific ideas have come to the forefront, there still have been this whole group of artists all over America and other places as well that still focus on the real, that still focus on subjects like portraiture, figure studies, landscape, still life. Sometimes these are represented as tremendous fantasies. Sometimes they are super realistic, but we're really happy to be able to show that tension between experimentation and sort of a historical continuation of particular modes of painting. And that includes photography here in this gallery. So since I'm only 10 minutes over, I will leave it open to the last sets of questions that you have. And if there's anybody still on this call still, please come and visit the museum. And I hope you have enjoyed your little tour.